all learn how to do it properly this time around. So hopefully everyone's got the hang of it and do it. For all of those not in Victoria, you're probably enjoying freedom as usual. So well done. But in the middle of all of that, we've got a new code. Isn't that exciting, Dino? You're very pumped about it, I can tell.
Oh, mate, if this was, I've been chafing at the bit for this session, Bruce. Yes, absolutely. Got to find myself something to do in the lull time in Melbourne. Absolutely.
3 years in the making, this new code. So we've had 3 years of inquiries and reports and consultation and everything. So, you know, it's fantastic. We've now got a new code. And so probably the longest time it's ever taken between an inquiry and a new law, 3 years, but the quickest time for implementation, because it was the next day from when they released it till some of the things took effect. So, so we're going to hear about a few of those things today, but just a quick intro. So I'm Bruce McFarlane. I'm the CEO of BlueRock Group, and I'm also a director of BDC Partners. So for those of you who haven't heard of BlueRock before, we're an entrepreneurial advisory firm. So we've got two parts of our business. We've got a professional services part with accounting, finance, digital, law, and a number of other parts with a couple of hundred people. And we've got an investment part of our business where we co-own and co-operate a number of businesses in hospitality, retail, property, and technology. We're also partnering with BDC Partners today. And so BDC Partners help businesses to grow by removing the headaches for franchisors. So we'll hear a little bit more about some of the headaches that franchisors have got later on today. We've got a panel today. We've got Melissa Strain, who's an Associate Director of BlueRock Law. Welcome, Mel. We've got David Lindsay, who's the CEO of BDC Partners. Welcome, Dave. And we've got Luke Ashdown, who's an Associate Lawyer at BlueRock as well. So welcome to you guys. But today we're here to discuss the key changes in the code that was released by the Minister last Tuesday. But just a couple of logistics. So we're recording the session, as Nikita said, so we will send out a link to you later on. If possible, I'd love it if you could turn your videos on, because I'm trying to make this interactive. So I know there's a couple of people that have got their videos off, Jamie and Mark. I'm going to ask you questions anyway. So if you turn your video on, that'd be fantastic to really to be part of the conversation, because what we're trying to do here is really, we'll run through the changes and Mel and Dave and Luke will talk about them, but we really want to see and hear from you as to how these changes are going to affect you and in your business. So as interactive as possible. If you want to ask questions, again, you can wave at me and ask a question, or just put it in the chat and I'll get to it in the next break as well. So yeah, keen to hear from all of you. We have got a number of people that registered that I know are going to just be watching the video as well. So I think we've had over 70 registrations. So some of the people will be watching us later on as they're in Melbourne, walking around the park or doing something in lockdown. But just a little bit of background. So the changes of the code are brought about to help change the balance, or, you know, maybe improve the balance between franchisors and franchisees. Bruce Bilson, as the Ombudsman and a former business partner of Dave and I in BDC Partners, talked about this. So Nikita, I might just get you to play a very brief video of Bruce Bilson talking about the changes.
Entering. Franchising is a really big deal in Australia. About $1 in $11 generated in our economy is through a franchise system. It's a great model of entrepreneurship where you have that mutually supportive relationship between franchisee and franchisor, motivated by the success of the franchisee. This week, another big deal happened, a strengthening of the franchise code. It ensures that people who are thinking about entering into a franchise business investment have all the relevant information that they need. What's the nature of the risks that they're considering? What are the leasing arrangements for a property that might be part of the arrangement? Are there any rebates that are another part of the relationship between the brand and some of their suppliers? These are important considerations, as well as major capital investment expenditure that might be on the radar screen, so prospective franchisees can make really good informed decisions. That's good stuff. And supported with the establishment of a franchise register, that's on the way as well. This is a great week for franchising. There's also an opportunity, though, to get problems that might arise sorted out quickly. The franchise code encourages businesses to sort it out within their brands and systems. But if that doesn't happen, my office can help. We can facilitate good discussions to see if we can find a result and an outcome, or we can facilitate mediation. What's new about this week's announcement, though, is if the parties agree, we can send a grievance or a dispute off to arbitration and get it resolved that way. These are great news. Great week for franchising. Franchising is a great way of pursuing entrepreneurial activities when it's done well, and a real important contributor to our national economy.
So there's Bruce as a regulator, and his view on it's been a great week for franchising. I guess an alternative view is that franchising is pretty regulated already in Australia, and the changes to things like public disclosure of rebates, ability of franchisees to elect to exit a system at any time, the watering down of restraints, they may cause major changes to some businesses and how they operate. And so, maybe systems need to think about their model more generally as a result of these changes. But before we get into the detail, just, as a former franchisor, Dave, what's your comment on the changes?
Well, firstly, I'll probably have to reach out to BB and comment on how discreet his microphone is there, but I'm not sure if everybody else seeing it. Bang. I think with the changes, Bruce, to be honest with you, if you're doing things right and you've got the best interest in place for the franchisee, a lot of these changes shouldn't have too much of an impact. But depending on how the system is structured with regards to rebates is a key one, that's probably going to be the most impactful. But if you've got the best interests of the franchisee in place, they should be able to be worked in pretty easily.
What about you, Scott? What are your thoughts, mate?
I think, like, my personal view, and everyone's got their own sort of take on all this stuff, but my thinking is that there's enough regulations already in place, and like an information statement for a disclosure document for a franchise agreement, we just get it right. Like, just get the disclosure document right at the right level. But we create more rules rather than getting right the ones we've got. So, but we've got to play the game by whatever they deal us.
Yeah, Dino, what about you, mate?
I concur with Scott on some of those points. I think it's regulation for the sake of regulation. I think it was, I don't know if it was 2015 or 17, we had to do an information page on franchising, which was a snapshot on the industry. Nobody was reading it. That's real. And I've got to say, I don't think anyone's going to read this one little pager on your document too, on your business. So some parts make sense, absolutely. I like some of the arbitration options and stuff like that. I think that gives some comfort to franchisees. Some stuff's probably, but maybe not as relevant to us being in food and beverage. Reducing the length of the agreement or ceasing it. Most of our agreements are linked to leases and things like that, so that's probably not as effective for us. The rebate one, we'll probably talk about a bit more. Jury's still out on that, given the fact that we don't share our rebates, and I think that to me is just going to create angst amongst people. We list who gives us rebates now when you put dollar figures on it. And I'm a franchisor. We also operate half our network, so we contribute to half of our buying group. But I know franchisees will be pissed off if they see numbers. So it's an interesting balance, that one. That's enough from me at this stage.
No, that's cool, mate. We're going to talk about rebates a bit because I think that's one of the big topics. Is anyone else any general comments, or we dive into the detail? Well, I guess the thing is, probably one thing is that the exposure draft that was released in November, the changes are substantially the same. There's about 80-90% as was anticipated last year. Some of the key differences around the details on the fact sheet, as Dean was talking about, dispute resolution and disclosure requirements have changed a little bit, and the termination provisions have changed. But and the fact that the changes come into place on the 1st of July, so there's not a lot of lead-in time, and the 2nd of June for some of them. So it's interesting, that we've had 3 years to do that, and it was pretty quick to implement. But Luke, I'll go to you to start with. So tell us about the key fact sheet, and where do I find a key fact sheet?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Bruce. So as just discussed, franchisors are going to have to start providing prospective franchisees with what's called a key disclosure information fact sheet. The purpose of it is to draw particular attention to what are considered the most important information points contained in the disclosure document. It'll only contain info that is from the disclosure document. There's no need to dive into anything else. And we're told that you can download a template from the ACCC's website. Last time I looked, which was last night, it wasn't on there yet, but I'm sure it'll be there shortly.
Cool. And so Mel, when do the franchisors have to provide it to the franchisees?
So it needs to be provided together with the franchise agreement and disclosure document to commence the 14-day disclosure period before they sign. They've added a couple of other requirements in there with the documents that you need to provide. So if any earnings information is provided, it needs to be provided at least 14 days before signing. And if it's provided before you provide those other documents, it needs to be provided again with the disclosure document so that it's all there together, and also the lease and disclosure statement, but we'll talk about that a little bit later.
Okay. And so Luke, do you still have to provide an information statement?
Yep, you certainly do. The code has now made it abundantly clear that the information statement must be provided to prospective franchisees prior to the provision of any other information, such as the disclosure document or the franchise agreement.
There's a couple of steps involved. So Mel, in the disclosure, you mentioned earlier that, you know, there's some changes. So, and we've touched on it already. The most significant change relates to rebates. So what do franchisors need to disclose now?
So as Dean said, there was already a requirement to disclose some basic information about rebates. The big change, as Dean also mentioned, is that now you need to put in a dollar figure. That's the total amount of rebates expressed as a single percentage of total group purchases from each supplier. And then again, as you need to at the minute, you need to advise them if it's being shared with franchisees or not. And that the only circumstances you're not required to disclose that information if it's being shared completely with franchisees.
Okay, so Dave, from a commercial point of view, you know, as a franchisor, do you think franchisors are going to be disadvantaged by the changes in rebate disclosure?
Well, I think, Bruce, because of the new public registrar, where people are going to be able to see each other's disclosure documents, they're more than likely going to be able to see what sort of supplier rebates are in place with suppliers. So you'll be able to shop around and see who's doing what with who. There's also, with regards to how the franchisor is structured, you know, are they a co-op? Do they survive on rebates, or do they have royalty structures in place? Like, what is the fundamental system that's in place that derives revenue for the franchisor? And then it comes back to, what does the franchisor do with that rebate? Do they reinvest it back into the franchisee, or do they use it for R&D, innovation, whatever, with the franchisor? And because of the public register, it's going to become a lot more competitive when selling your franchise, because they're going to have a lot more exposure across different brands. When they are making that final decision on which franchise system to go for. So I suppose if you take a look at, for example, Coca-Cola is doing a supply into one group, and what are they doing with this other group there? That's going to be public. That's going to be public knowledge now.
So I want to get some feedback here from I'm going to go to a couple of people with cameras off if they're willing to talk with food brands. But before we go to some of the food brands, probably start with you, Jamie, and Office Choice. Obviously, your model is very much about supplying goods. Have you thought about the rebates and how that affects you, Office Choice?
Yeah, Bruce, I have had a discussion with Brad, our CEO, around what that looks like based on the conversation or the webinar that the FCA did last week. I suppose it's just about getting 100% clarity on what it actually looks like. So we talk about as a percentage of total group purchases for that supplier and dollar amount. So look, I think in a lot of instances, the vast majority of our rebates go back to our members. And if they don't, because we act as a cooperative, a lot of it goes back in a special rebate to our shareholders at the end of the year. But yeah, it's certainly going to be interesting to pick up on David's point around the competition in the market. For us, there's Office Choice, and then there's Office Brands or Office National. So I suppose it suddenly gives a bit of transparency to what's going on amongst the supplier community, and particularly I think for everybody, where you've got this vision and understanding of your own business and what you're getting, and some thoughts or ideas about what's happening in other places. But all of a sudden, it's going to open up our suppliers as well to scrutiny and what's going on in that space. So I think that's going to be really interesting as well.
Yeah, it is. It's definitely having flow-on effects. And Melissa, you're from a food brand too as well. So what have you thought through the rebate situation?
Sorry, I just unmute myself. Look, we're just working through it at the moment. Obviously, with the food brand, we've got a endless list of suppliers. So for us, it's just sort of getting our head around what we actually need to do and then start to put that in place. So early stages for us at the moment.
Yeah. And Dean, and for you guys, are you ready to disclose the information? Is that going to take a while to sort of work through?
No, look, I think that the point David makes probably more the interesting one. I'm not quite sure if Schweppes are going to be excited about them disclosing the ripping deal that they did for us as a re-sign on and our most recent coffee supplier and stuff like that. To me, I'm more worried about those ramifications as well too, because if I'm in suppliers sort of shoes, I'm going to say, well, this is great. I'm just going to do a uniform deal for everybody because it's going to be out in the marketplace now anyways, which goes against their grain of, I want that account, I'll do something special as an example. So it's got a whole bunch of tree branches, and I probably sound like a politician here. I'm still undecided as to how we're going to manage it, because last year was really an exceptional year. I did some amazing sign-on deals for some change of supplier arrangements that in isolation would look like, oh my God, you nasty franchisor, but it was the difference between us hanging in there or not as well too. So there's some really interesting flow-ons with this. So I've had no problem listing who my suppliers are, who provided us rebates in the past. I did have one question. I'm not sure if this is the appropriate time or not to ask around that. Are you going to have question time later on, Bruce? Or
Yeah, go now. That's fine.
Let's just say you've got 5 or 6 categories of key suppliers, and one of those categories you're not 100% from an enforcement point of view, because I noticed it said that one of the exemptions on rebate declaration was if you didn't force your franchisees to go through a particular approved supplier. So I might have fruit and veg as an example where I say, this is a supplier you can use, but you're not obligated to use this particular supplier. Where do I stand as a franchisor on that? Am I just not listing anything around that? Because I'm not forcing my franchisees, as I said, to use that particular supplier or not. We're a bit like, we've got a bunch of small suppliers that we don't enforce compliance on because they're localized suppliers as well. So for me, it's the big ones, coffee, drinks, and my imports and stuff like that. They're the real key ones. And I'm sort of just working out how I'm going to talk to them, say, hey guys, your information is going to be out in the normal general public now. Any tire kicker can jump on and see the dollars that you gave us last year.
Also, Dan, it expands into fit out as well. So if you're getting rebates from fit out, equipment, everything like that, their franchisees are going to be saying, mate, I pay you a franchise fee and you're cutting the ticket on the top here as well. So what's going on there?
I'm probably fairly comfortable on that side because I know we have never, as a franchisor, we've got a particular philosophy, which is once they start operating, our sort of stuff kicks in. In fact, we built stores at cost for franchisees. We don't even load it up half the time because we want to just get them in and get them profitable. But you're right, this is all about any type of financial gain from any form of supplier from the point of signing of that franchise agreement with David, the franchisee. What have I received as a benefit that they need to be aware of?
Yeah,
the bigger groups will be worried about that. I can assure you, significantly worried.
Yeah, I think the thing is, you're right, and Mel, jump in but if the fact that if you don't mandate it, you don't have to disclose the full amount. So if they've got alternatives, then you're okay. What about, so Ali or Amanda or anyone from Retail Zoo, have you been dealing with this in the Boost brand or other brands?
I guess in relation to rebates, Bruce, it's probably more for the operations guys as well. Like being from the franchising side of things, we're not probably exposed to it as much as those guys would be. Yep. But as is probably the common theme throughout the whole room is, everyone's got some sort of, I guess, rebate kickback to it, but it's just about managing how we move forward.
Yeah, no worries. Changing tack to list a little bit, Mel. So you also, the disclosure information in relation to the lease has also changed. So what's happened now?
That's right. So Dave just touched on it then. You have to disclose any incentives or financial benefits received from landlords where the franchisor holds the lease. On top of that, they're trying to protect franchisees from entering into a franchise agreement without knowing the detail of the lease. So as I mentioned earlier, they've added the lease and any disclosure statement provided by the landlord to the list of documents to be provided to kick off that 14-day disclosure period. And if that's not possible, for example, if a franchise agreement is signed before there's a site, then the franchisee's right to cool off extends to 14 days after those documents are provided, so that the franchisee has every opportunity to really have a look at the lease and know what they're signing up to before they're locked in.
Yeah, so
which is going to completely change the development strategies of a lot of systems out there. So whether you go with territory first, sign up, and then find lease after, or whether you're led by develop out the territory, understand what the overall investment is, and then have all documents ready to sign. So it's going to have a significant impact on the recruitment process as well, and the development strategy.
what about you, Amanda? What's your approach on this?
Oh, look, it just throws everything out the window that, you know, on the usual processes that we have, to be honest. You know, we won't go unconditional on the site and lock it away until we've got a franchisee. We just won't take them on as a company store. So, you know, as much as doing deals with the majors, you know, we've got precedent leases. We can, you know, try and populate them as easily as possible and provide them to potential franchisees. But yeah, it just adds extra complexity into the process that's already a fairly detailed and lengthy process at the moment. So we'll just find ways to get around it. But yeah, it's annoying.
Yeah. And what about Kim at Spudbard? You how are you managing this process?
Yeah, I think we're going to be okay with that sort of one. With any new locations we get, with being such a sort of small team, we've got a pretty good disclosure with any current franchisees about what's coming in, what we've already got in place. And a lot of the time, they want to know the ins and outs of the lease before they make a commitment anyway, because a lot of time with such sort of small price points and small profit margins, the lease is critical to the deal anyway. So I think we'll be okay with that one.
Yeah. So other disclosure things. So Luke, the disclosure regime has been expanded to talk about all disputes, not just litigation. So what does that look like for franchisors?
Yeah, so in addition to litigious disputes, which franchisors are still going to be required to disclose, franchisors will need to disclose the percentage of franchisees in their system that were paid to any alternative dispute processes in the previous financial year. So this includes any disputes dealt with via conciliation or mediation or arbitration.
Yeah, so we're going to talk a little bit more about the whole dispute resolution process, and obviously Bruce Bilson's going to play a role in his office in this process. But from the franchisor's point of view, is making sure that all of these types of alternative disputes are now documented and you're keeping track of it. Probably something I forgot to mention at the start. We'll send around a table of the changes. Most of you probably seen something from the FCA or others, but we'll put a table together of the changes. Mel, what about another one that talks about goodwill arrangements? So what do franchisors have to do there?
This one's a pretty simple one. They've just added it to the information you have to disclose about what happens at the end of the term. And there just needs to be a statement in there about whether or not the franchisee is entitled to any goodwill that they've generated throughout the term at the end, as often is the case that they're not. And you have to include a statement to that effect.
Okay. So Dave, a broader one, sort of the change to the cooling off period of 14 days, as well as, you know, at applying to transfers, and, you know, just thinking through from a franchisor's point of view is how they manage resales or the sale process with these changes to the rules around disclosure and cooling off. So what's your thoughts on what franchisors need to do now? Is it a big change, or is it pretty simple?
I think they just need to have, like, for me, it will be an update into the operations manual outlining key dates and getting franchisees across those key dates. That, you know, it's not just a matter of throw your business up on Seek and then come and hit us up to say this person's bought the business. It's a matter of, okay, well, there has to be key disclosure dates put in place. So clear defined timelines, have it documented in your operations manual, and make sure when you're onboarding franchisees, or you do understand that they're exiting, is that you guys actually play an important role with that new disclosure period.
Okay. So in terms of transfers in a system, Mark, have you had many transfers, and is this going to affect your process in Graffiti Eaters?
No, we haven't had any transfers as such, being in a new network. So no, I don't think it'll have a big impact on our model moving forward.
Yeah. What about you, Jason and Flooring Extra? Is it the change of your process in terms of resales of sites?
Well, at the moment, we've actually had a couple of transfers, but I think it's more about the renewal side of things that I'm interested in. We actually just had a franchisee sort of just sell his franchise, not underneath us, but we didn't really know about it. Next thing, we've got people going, "Oh, we're trading as Flooring Extra. Can we get into your system?" So, you can write all the documents, the ops manuals and all that, but they've got to follow it too. So it's a bit of keep your eye over it. But yeah, just on the renewal side, I think for me,
I think that's right, Jason. With what Dave was saying is that having the systems in place. Some brands they mandate the whole process, and others, allow the franchisees to have a little bit more sort of rope in terms of how they sell their business and what sort of requirements are in providing the consent to the sale. So I think now, Dave, that's right, isn't it? They have to. If they were pretty loose around their processes, it probably needs to tighten up just a little bit.
It needs to tighten up a hell of a lot. And what it does show, Jason, it shows that the franchisor does have a process in place. So if it's ever challenged or something happens, you've got it documented there, mate.
Right.
So it shows that you do have the system in place.
Yeah, 100%.
Chris, can I ask a question on this one?
Yep.
If it's okay. Look, us as being a retail franchise, I've got a real problem with this one, because if you look at the definition of what that cooling off period is, where it says they've either signed a franchise agreement, this is for assignments I'm talking about specifically, or when they take control of the business, for that 14 days. I mean, I'm not quite sure as a landlord, I'm not sure if they've factored in like the Retail Tenancies Act and all that stuff. If I've taken over a business or I've taken control, and I'm an outgoing franchisee as an example, mate, I want my bank guarantee replaced. I want everything gone, done and dusted. See you later. Well, my exposure should be gone. And what we're saying is, actually, now you've got 14 days till after you take control, but you can still pull out. This is really messy. I'm not sure if the retail tenancy is really complex anyway, and then you overlay our compliance stuff. This one's a little bit murky, I think. I'm not sure if it's going to play out as clean as what the industry intention was, perhaps. That's all.
I agree with that, Dean. It's kind of like I bought the house, I went in and I painted the wall, and then I realised, you know what? I don't like the house.
yeah. And I'm like, see you later, Dave. Enjoy the house.
I'm leaving now, and can you give me my cash back?
So I'm not quite sure how this one's going to play out, to be honest.
Mel, do you want to? There's an example, I think, in the exposure draft.
Yeah. There is, Dean. We were having the exact same conversations last week. It just sounds like an absolute disaster. But reading the explanatory memorandum, the cooling off period expires 14 days from when they become a franchisee or on the date that they take over. So it's not 14 days from when they take over.
Gotcha.
Once they settle and go in, they can't then cool off and get their money back, because you're right, that would cause a whole host of problems for.
Yeah, so if I'm signed, even on the franchise agreement side of stuff, Mel, I've got a franchise agreement with a date that I sign. It's really not really physically taking effect 14 days afterwards. So it's just I'd like anything, you want these documents, all the dates to line up for everything. As I said, I still think there's going to be potential issues especially with the Retail Leases Act. That's all.
Yeah, I'm sure there will. I mean, my reading of it is if they become a franchisee on the date that they take over, so for example, the franchisee signs in the lead up and the franchisor signs on the completion date, there is no window for them to call off. So that might be a way
to circumvent that. Yeah.
But that is something we're going to have to look at in more detail.
And I think Dean, this comes back to making sure that you have those timelines in place, because and it's that whole resale timeline of trying to have this document executed or trying to get everything lined up. And listen, it is like herding cats. We've all been there. We've done it. But if you want to reduce that 14-day disclosure, well, then that's what it takes into effect, really.
Yeah, true. Yeah, look, it's about issuing documents with plenty of time, right?
Exactly. Yeah, and it's showing from your side as a franchisor again that you're doing the right thing. You've been accommodating from the very start.
Yep. Just changing tack a little bit as well. Dispute resolution is one of the key changes under the code. And so, Luke, the code now refers to ADR. What does ADR mean? And practically, what are the implications for franchisors?
Well, so for those that don't know, ADR stands for Alternative Dispute Resolution. Alternative dispute resolution refers to means of resolving disputes other than through the courts, I guess. So reference to mediation in parts of the code will now be replaced with reference to an ADR process. So what this practically means is that franchise agreements may now include clauses which allow parties to try and resolve disputes through a range of means, including conciliation, mediation, or arbitration, for example.
So Dave, our old friend and business partner, Bruce Bilson from the Australian Small Business and Family Enterprise Ombudsman, has a bigger role in managing disputes, as we saw in the video before. How do you think that office is going to play a part now?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because you obviously have BB, who was involved in the franchising code of conduct some years ago, and then he stepped into his role at the FCA. So he really understands both sides of the relationship. So it will play a key part when if it does get to if disputes do get to that stage where it's unreconcilable. But in saying that, it's like I've said it a few times, making sure that your dispute resolution process is clearly defined in your operations manual, and it goes along with the disclosure document and the code and everything like that. So that if there is a I suppose a dispute on the horizon, is that you're dealing with it straight away as per what you've outlined in your processes, to try and basically see if you can get to an amicable result prior to going to mediation.
So Belinda, I'm going to throw to you. What about disputes in not in your existing business, but in previous businesses? Have you, how do you see this process working with Bruce Bilson's office?
Sorry, I've joined just late, but believe it or not, I haven't actually ever been involved in a dispute. I've been lucky enough not to have actually been involved in one, so I'm probably not the best person to comment here.
Oh, jeez.
Squeaky clean over here.
Too nice. David, maybe we can go to you because you have, I know.
Yes. I've been in a dispute or two. Yeah. So it's really you want to try and deal with the dispute before it escalates, and you want to act quickly on, as soon as someone's has those seeds of discontent, really rely on your support team to understand how is the relationship with the franchisee. Are they aloof in the relationship? I suppose what I'm trying to say is be proactive about the situation, and sit down, talk to them, make sure everything's all right, and also have a supporting arm there for them, because at the end of the day, unless they're intentionally trying to cause an issue, because we're probably going to deal with that later on with regards to terminating, mutual termination, unless they're deliberately trying to cause an issue, things can be resolved if you just sit down and understand where they're coming from.
And hopefully Bruce's office allows with that, with the conciliation processes and obviously arbitration, to try and avoid the courts, because it can be pretty stressful, expensive process to go through the courts. One of the changes, Mel, is in relation to multi-party disputes. I know this is a challenge for any franchise systems that have had similar issues with franchisees, but they've been able to keep them separate and manage each dispute on its merits, rather than allowing them to join together unless there's a full class action. So how do you think the multi-party dispute process is going to work now?
Oh yeah, that's right. So they've opened the door sort of to informal class actions. If there's a group of franchisees that have the same problem with the franchisor, they can activate the dispute resolution procedure together and have an ADR practitioner appointed, regardless of whether the franchisor's happy about that or not. Another issue that could cause problems for the franchisor is that it says now in the code to facilitate that process, franchisees can breach the confidential obligations in their franchise agreement and discuss the issues that they have with the franchisor, which is probably the very last thing the franchisor wants franchisees to be chatting about.
Particularly if there's any sort of sweetheart deals that have been done with individual franchisees along the journey, like that's gonna play a pivotal role in that breaking of confidentiality.
Michelle, have you had any experience with this with franchisees?
No, but I have just entered into some sweetheart deals, so I'm cringing.
Sorry, Michelle.
But how long is it going to take now for that to get out?
Yeah.
Well, Michelle, can I share something with you? Even if there's confidentiality, eventually they talk. Just when franchisors talk, they will. It's human nature. I'm really not fussed about this one, I've got to say.
Oh, you're not fussed, Dino? You reckon they...
Oh, I just think, if you've got a problem which is systematic, they're going to talk. That's the reality. Yeah, I mean, that's if you as a franchisor you got a problem and it's this thematic within your network, they'll talk to each other. They're not silly. The reason why we chose these guys is because they've got half a brain in the first place. They're going to talk to each other. So I'm probably taking the opposing view on this one. I just think that they've always spoken about stuff, and only very selectively, if you're a family member of the franchisor or something like that, they may shut their mouth. Come on.
Yeah,
they know about deals that have been done in the past. Of course they do. And that's why they want more of them in the future.
Scott, what about you? Have you had franchisees sort of getting together and chatting about similar type issues?
No, we've avoided it, which is a good thing. So, but I think you're right. Like what Dean sort of said there, I think that in most cases, I think that anything that's deemed to be confidential, it's not confidential till it's been shared anyway, for most of it. So I think in terms of the operations, because I don't think that a lot of the franchisees really understand the nature of confidentiality and the like. So they're pretty basic. But ours is pretty clean. Our model's pretty clean. So we're pretty fortunate. There's not too much in it. So lucky.
And Luke, what about arbitration? So obviously that's a change to the code now. Allowing that. So how do you think that's going to work?
Yeah, so as a bit of background, I guess, for those that don't know, arbitration involves having an independent arbitrator make a binding decision on a set of facts. This is a more cost-effective means of resolving a dispute compared to going to court, obviously. In order to use the new process, which is going to be specified, both parties will need to agree in writing to it and then notify the Ombudsman. Once this has happened, the Ombudsman will then appoint an arbitrator within 14 days. Shortly thereafter, the arbitrator will notify the parties of the time and place of the arbitration, and all parties will need to attend the arbitration, and there's a civil penalty for not attending. And then the arbitrator must advise the parties of the outcome within 14 days of the hearing. In terms of costs, it's to be shared equally between the parties that participate in the arbitration. So 50-50 if there's 2, if there's 3, it'll be divided 3 ways.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I'm not sure, Bill, if you want to comment, but I know in arbitration is something that as an alternative, it can throw up a whole can of worms. So for you, Bill, arbitration, probably not necessarily a great option compared to courts, but an option.
Yeah, our experience as arbitration is fraught with fallibility, shall I say. It seems to be a resource that has no judicial overview. So there's absolutely no recourse if the arbitrator makes a mistake, shall I say.
Yep.
And I agree with everyone who's said before, don't let it get that far.
Yeah, so the way it'd be interesting to see how the arbitration under the Bruce Bilson's office works, and hopefully that that it does similar experiences that some systems have had with arbitration not always being positive. It can be positive.
Some of the things Luke just said sound promising,
yeah. Like
a 14-day decision process, whereas ours is dragged out for rather a long time.
Yeah. Has anyone else had experience with arbitration as an alternative to going through the courts? No, stayed out of it. That's
just in divorce.
Well, that's probably, yes, different situation there. So probably one of the other issues that comes up, and we've touched on it a little bit earlier. So Luke, that franchisors can only enforce their restraint clause if there's been a serious breach of the franchise agreement. What does a serious breach look like?
I'm sure you're going to get some comments from everybody on this one. The code doesn't and will not define the term serious. The logic here is that the franchising sector is diverse, and what amounts to a serious breach will differ amongst the different franchise systems. Our suggestion here is to define or attempt to define what a serious breach is in your own franchise agreement, so that there can be no confusion about what serious means. Ultimately, if it goes to court, it might not be held up, but it's worth a shot. Yeah,
the courts, they'll look at it, and obviously what's applicable. If you've got nothing in your agreement, then that's also fine, and the courts will work it out whether it was serious or not, and whether the restraint applies. I guess legally, that's enforcing restraints is never been a simple thing from a legal point of view, anyway. But Dave, from a commercial point of view, what do you think that franchisors are going to do to protect their IP and their system?
Like there is that hovering factor that people can try and terminate the agreement 2 years into the agreement. They've come in, they've got your IP, they understand how the business operates, and they want to leave due to a serious breach. But this comes back to the fundamental structure of your business, how it's all set up from the beginning. Like if you've got particular software that is customized, or it's off the shelf, but you've customized it for your use, make sure that there's exclusivity in place with that, so that it can't be shared around, so that they can't just open up the next day with that software. Who owns the marketing channels? So who owns the social media, Facebook, Instagram? Are they admin of that, or are you guys admin and they are editors? Who owns all of that? Who owns the database and the customers? Is that well defined? And how are you going to communicate any sort of change to them with the ownership there? But most importantly, now it's not IP, but it's directly linked to protecting yourself, is that if you take a look at the lease, if your head's on lease, well, then you can take over that site, you can step in. But if you don't go head on lease, what you can do is you can look at having a tripartite agreement or something with the landlord that gives you the opportunity to go in and take over that business. You can basically talk to the landlord and say, listen, the franchisee is in serious breach of the agreement. We're going to be mutually terminating. So I'd like to come in, I'd like to exercise my step-in clause, so that you can have that continuity with business.
Yeah, so there's kind of legal ways to enforce restraints and practical ways to enforce restraints. And the challenge with the leasing, there's a few of you from leasing teams on the call, but is obviously the risks associated with taking all the sites, and whether if you're an emerging or a startup system and you're signing lots of leases, you'll be signing lots of personal guarantees, which is not ideal. But then again, you need to think about use your due diligence on the sites to try and enforce the restraints. But it's going to be a tricky one. One of the things about franchise agreements is to have these restraints in there that have been enforceable in the past. Yeah. Probably that we've touched on it a little bit again is the right to terminate. So franchisors and franchisees will both have the right to terminate an agreement now. So Luke, just starting on the franchisor side, what are the changes to their right to terminate the franchise agreement?
Sure. So franchisors now have to give franchisees 7 days written notice before terminating a franchise agreement. Previously, franchisors could terminate immediately in certain circumstances if the franchise agreement allowed. This 7-day period is intended to provide franchisees with an opportunity to dispute the proposed termination. If there is a dispute raised by a franchisee, the proposed termination cannot be effected until after the end of 28 days from the giving of the termination notice. This is to allow the parties to attempt to resolve the dispute and to allow the franchisee to commence urgent proceedings to stay or prevent the termination if they think it's appropriate. So as to protect the franchised business, franchisors may require franchisees to cease to operate all or part of their business during this period. This is provided that the franchise agreement provides the franchisor with this right, and the franchisor has served a notice to that effect on the franchisee.
So putting some rules around franchisors, which is which I don't think is a massive change. It's just probably a process that franchisors need to go through. Probably the biggest change, which has been discussed today and was also a big issue in November when the exposure drafts came out, was the franchisee's right to terminate. So a franchisee, you fall out of love, they want to leave, they want to break up with you. What can they do, Mel? And what do you have to do as the franchisor?
So they haven't so much been given the right to terminate, but they have been given the right to request an early termination. So they can do that at any time during the term of their agreement. And then the franchisor has 28 days to respond to that request. And again, you don't have to accept their request and let them out necessarily. But if the response is no, you need to stay, then you need to provide a substantive response to that request. And then, of course, I suppose if they're not happy with your response, they'll generally go down the dispute resolution road and see where that leads you both.
So do you think, Dave, this is going to have implications for franchisors that, potentially, the early stages of greenfield sites, it's difficult for the franchisees. They're struggling a little bit. The franchisor is not making a lot of money in those early stages to change their model, because if a franchisee can get out of a franchise agreement with notice, a couple of years in, is that going to change what the franchisor does in terms of collecting money up front?
Yeah, it's going to have a knock-on effect for the I suppose the emerging brands that are trying to get a foothold throughout the country, because they are very heavily reliant on the initial franchise fee, but also royalties. So having a net loss with people exiting the system earlier is going to be very challenging. I suppose to put a positive spin on this is that if somebody's not suited to your system, you're better off getting rid of them at the very start, because you're just going to be clashing from the get-go, and it's better just to break up and let them go on their way. But as long as you've got all of the appropriate IP secured and everything like that, where you can potentially continue on business in that area, it's important. I think one thing that this is going to really highlight is how franchisees are recruited. Are franchisors measuring cultural compatibility? And are they measuring, what are they putting in place to make sure that there's a strong evidence of a strong working relationship in place here, to avoid these sort of mishaps at some stage in the future. So there's going to be a lot of systems out there that have promised the world and not delivered, and come when this comes into place, there's going to be a load of franchisees that want to move on. It's going to have a detrimental effect to franchisors who've done things poorly in the past.
Matt, what about you? A new system, emerging system, is this going to change the way that you do anything, that if a franchisee can get out after a year or two?
I don't know yet. Haven't really had a chance to have that discussion with you yet, Bruce.
Yeah.
No, look, I'm sort of listening to these things. It's hard to tell, but I think it goes back to that original point that I think Dave made. Maybe, that's right. If they're not the right fit, maybe it might be the right way to get people out anyway. But our system, we don't really have, there's not a lot of upfront costs for people to get in. It's not big numbers, I believe there's plenty of people around who'd like to get into it at the moment. So especially once they start to see the way the model unfolds. So
yeah, so the nurse next door models, it's, you're having some great success recruiting, but it's interesting because you do obviously spend a lot of time in that recruitment, induction, bringing them into the business, and you do invest a lot of time. So I guess it's disappointing and frustrating if they were to leave the system quite quickly with the amount of investment you make in time. So I don't know if anyone else is, Mark, what about you when bringing someone into the business and then they're able to exit quickly? Is that something that's going to change the way you operate?
No, I don't think so. It's sort of what people are saying there. Our philosophy is the same, really. You only want people on board that have got the passion and the dedication and going to make the commitment to it. So, we have had a couple that have wavered, or we've had a couple with some mental health challenges that we've had to work through. And I think it won't change things in that side of things. I think once they're not suitable and they've made that decision that perhaps it's not for them, then it's time to call it quits anyway.
And Ali, in a retail zoo context, is that going to change the way that your processes work?
No, I don't think so. I think probably in addition to that, if there is an unhappy partner in the network, you'd probably discuss around exit strategies anyway, around deciding a store over, depending on the profitability of the store, obviously. So you have those conversations well before that. You don't want them to walk away losing the whole investment as well on another side of things. So I guess from our side of things, it's not really going to change anything. It's just more about having those even more transparent conversations around, I guess, where they're at with the operations guys and us as well. So
I think a valuable point there, and Ali, you touched on it slightly, is that if you're delivering as a franchisor and people are profitable and people are feeling collaborated and they're feeling involved in the direction of the system, why would they want to get out? Do you know what I mean? So like it comes back to having those conversations very early on. Do you guys have measuring matrix to score their engagement? Are they showing up to meetings on time? Are they making their appointments, talking about problems? Are they sharing information? These are all key things that you start seeing from a psychological relationship breakdown, and just reacting to that sooner as opposed to letting the seed of discontent go ahead and flourish. I think it's taking more of a proactive step as opposed to a reactive.
Yeah, totally agree.
I think that's right. So we're actually putting a little ad. We're going to run a session on the life cycle of the franchisee. We're going to run a similar session in about a month and talk about that process that franchisors are going through to bring people in, to recruit them, to induct them, to manage their performance, and then also the exit process as well. So they're all key steps. So this change, whilst it seems scary for some systems, it may be, if you look at it from a revenue point of view and say, well, people have signed up, we were going to earn royalties from these people for the next 5 years. They've gone after 2. That's a lot. I've lost a royalty stream. I guess that's one way to look at it. The other way to look at it is they're probably not the right people in the system anyway. So the amount of time that you're going to spend on managing them all the way is tough. Another financial one, Dave, is capital expenditure. And so, franchisors, like to be able to have their system evolve. And sometimes that can mean expending, franchisees having to spend money, whether it be on technology or whether it be on sites or things like that. So, the changes in the code, how do you think that's going to impact brands like emerging brands or more established ones?
Yeah, it's and it is interesting because established brands basically have a track record that they can go on. Like, what is a refurb cost? What is it as per the lease? And they've got an understanding of fit with the fit out company to get them in there, and they know they've done it, so they've got experience to go by. The challenge is going to be for emerging brands who are, still innovating. They're not 100%. They may not be 100% secure on the pause that they're on, or they might move. Like I reflect on my own business model. Was we went from a group purchase to a membership model, because that had a better implication on the cash flow of the business, et cetera, and that was a capital expense, but we incurred that ourselves at the head. So it's going to be challenging for emerging brands because they're really starting to define out their system over the next 2, 3, 4 years as they're growing. And some of these capital expenditure items are going to be hard to predict. Whereas with your established franchisors, hopefully a lot of you guys have a 5-year plan in place. You understand where the market, well, it's hard to do it after COVID, but you've somewhat of an idea where the market's going, what sort of service offering you see yourselves providing in the future, innovation, and most importantly, that you're providing those ideas of capital expenditure. We're going to have to disclose that now in the future. So it's going to be challenging for the emerging, but I think it's just another degree of complexity for the established to disclose.
Yeah. And Mel, there's some changes around the marketing fund rules.
Pretty minor language changes in the clause. The major change is that they've imposed penalties for breaching those obligations that already existed.
Yeah, I think the most significant ones were the review last time with the separate bank accounts and things like that. So it has changed the way from 10 years ago how people manage their marketing to how they're doing it now. But I think this time around it's not significant. And I might just so Luke, just in terms of how people want to vary their systems, can they unilaterally vary things?
Sure. So the code's been amended to prevent franchisors from varying a franchise agreement with retrospective effect unless the affected franchisee consents to the variation in writing. So no, franchisors cannot unilaterally vary a franchise agreement.
In the last couple of minutes, is just the registry. So there was a lot of talk about a franchise registry, and Bruce Bilson alluded to it in his video, but there's no information in the code around the registry. So Mel, do you know what the plans are in relation to the registry?
I think the plan at this stage is that it will be up and running early 2022. And the only information we really have about it is that franchisors will be required to provide up-to-date documents, probably annually, but it's not clear who's going to be running it or anything else.
And what they're going to do when they get it. So it's really the disclosure document, isn't it, that they're talking about is having to register that rather than the franchise agreement. But, you know, as a couple of people have spoken about today, you know, there's some pretty important information in a disclosure document that you may not want. And particularly now that the rebate information, the capital expenditure, there's a whole range of different things that need to be in the disclosure document. So it'll be really interesting how that process is managed. What happens, you know, can anyone access these documents? And if so, what can they do with them? So from a supplier's point of view, you don't really want that information in there that's publicly available, but we'll wait and see what all that means. That's all the questions we had. Is anyone else got any questions in the last minute or so that we didn't address in the discussion today?
Big one for me, Bruce. The rebate discussion, it says, I think I read somewhere that it excludes if you wholesale the material. So where we're the supplier, there's no obligation to disclose any of the financial windfall for the franchisor. Is that correct?
That's from your supply company, that's fine.
Yeah, okay. I think there'll be a few more people doing it to get around it. Obvious loophole, so.
Yeah. There'll be that many different variations of Coca-Cola.
Yeah. I mean, that's the reality, isn't it? When they do things, because like if you're a competitor like ours and many others, some are corporate type operators and some are franchise, you're going to try and keep as much private as possible. Simple.
Thank you very much. We're right on 2:30. So thank you very much for everyone that I dobbed into contribute to our discussion today. I think it's much more worthwhile if we hear from some of the brands that, you know, a lot of you on this call have been in franchising a lot longer than I have, or as long as I have. It was a fair few years. So thank you. Thanks to our panel, to Luke, to Mel, and to Dave for presenting today and to diving into all the detail of the changes to the code. As I mentioned, we're going to run with BDC and BlueRock running a few of these webinars over the next couple of months. So look forward to seeing you all again. And for those in Melbourne, stay safe, enjoy the lockdown. Hopefully we'll be out again next week. And thanks again for joining today. See ya.
See you guys.